Um, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to the conference organisers for organising this whole thing. And it's turning out to be a great conference so far, that's for sure. So my talk is about the myrtle rust process model, which is a tool we developed to understand the effects of weather and climate on the development and the spread and the management of myrtle rust in New Zealand. I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors here, Richard Turner from the National Institute of Water and Atmosphere, and Mike Barley from the software development company Hort Plus Limited. So going back to the 2017 myrtle rust incursion and the response by the Ministry for Primary Industries, they requested information on where and when myrtle rust was most likely to develop to support their surveillance operations. So we looked at some existing models for myrtle rust, which had included New Zealand. They weren't specifically for New Zealand necessarily, but they'd included New Zealand. Climax and Maxent and a couple of models that came out of a PhD at Lincoln University. And they all tended to predict high risk in the upper North Island. But for areas of lower risk, particularly in the South Island, there was quite a wide divergence of predictions. But these were correlative models, and they weren't actually suitable for the real-time predictions needed for operational decision-making by MPIs. So what we did was we sat down and looked at designing a fit-for-purpose model for that particular purpose. So a literature review suggested that myrtle rust biology was quite similar to that of cereal rusts, which have been studied in great detail, and the photograph there of striped rust of wheat, which could have been the one that Robert Park put up yesterday, actually, very similar photograph, and then myrtle rust on the Lophometis species there. Now for rusts, dry airborne spores depend on diurnal temperature and humidity cycles for their dispersal and infection. So accurate modelling would require hourly weather data. It needs a fine time step to try and understand how that diurnal cycling is going to affect rust development. So experience that I've had over the years with crop disease management models suggested that a weather-based risk model predicting variation in key infection cycle processes would probably be a good approach to use. This is a rust infection cycle diagram. I actually originally drew this in about 1982, shortly after you guys here sent us stripe rust. And I'm quite pleased that actually now that you've sent us myrtle rust, it's still quite an appropriate diagram or model to use. So the infection cycle, it starts with infection, and that's favoured by wetness or high relative humidity. A period of humidity is required, and relatively warm temperature and low light intensity. So those are all things that favour infection. So following infection, the rust goes into its latent phase. The latent period is heavily influenced by temperature for a given species. It varies between species and probably within species too, according to levels of resistance, but it's very strongly temperature dependent. And when it's initially inside the plant and it's unseen, but towards the end of the latent period, you start to see the first symptoms. And this is an interesting sort of cross-reference to Michael Bartlett's paper earlier today with the work that they were doing on detecting the latent infection inside the plant. And then, of course, at the end of the latent period, the first iridinia erupt, and we go into the infectious period, where we've got spores being produced and dispersed, and they can go around and complete the cycle. So the spore production part of it is, for rusts, is heavily driven by temperature. I'm not actually going to go into the spore production part of the model in this talk because just of time constraints, really. But so I'll start off focusing on the infection risk model, which is a response surface that was sort of modified, developed from a Brazilian paper in 1989 by Ruiz et al. And it's got, pointing over here, it's got temperature on one axis, and the number of hours of above 85% humidity, which is a measure of the wetness period, and then relative risk on the vertical scale there. And at temperatures of around the optimum of about 20 degrees C, the 50% of spores can actually infect within 6.5 hours, so it's a pretty fast process actually. And then at 20 degrees, it's 90% of infections happened in just over 11 hours. So when we come down to a cooler temperature like 15, for example, it takes about 11 or over 11 hours for 50% infection, and then until 24 hours for 90% infection to occur. And then below about 10 degrees or 10 to 12 degrees, there's very little infection at all. And also above 30 to 32, there's very little infection. So that response surface is the one that we have used to model infection risk. Now moving on to the latent period phase now, we got some really good data from our collaboration with Jeff Pegg and Louise Shuey in Brisbane. It was a combination of controlled environment data that they generated, particularly on Metrosideros excelsa, and then some field data that we developed in New Zealand as well on Lophometis species. So the Lophometis is highly susceptible, whereas the Pohutakoa Metrosideros excelsa has an element of resistance. And the latent period curves of those two are a little bit different at the lower end, so that there's more latent development at a slightly lower temperature for Lophometis, which may be part of a measure of its higher susceptibility. So the latent period overall is shortest at about 25 to 26 degrees. It's quite skewed towards that high temperature end. It becomes very long below 10 to 15 degrees, and also above 30 to 32 degrees. So it's a curve that really defines a lot of the aspects of the development of metal rust. We very often use the Lophometis curve in our modelling, which represents a worst case risk because of its greater development, slightly shorter minimum latent period and greater development at lower temperatures. So in terms of implementing the model, it was first implemented by NIWA using a virtual weather data grid generated by a numerical weather model, and that grid has a 1.5 kilometre spacing, so it's a pretty fine scale grid. And it uses hourly weather data, so it's fine time scale as well. And then the way they implemented that was to generate weekly risk maps. And so since 2017, these have been publicly available. They can be obtained through the metalrust.com website, which is maintained by Hort Plus. So those maps show each week four maps. There's mean and maximum infection risk on the top there. And then the next two down there, the sporulation risk, which I'm not saying much about, and the latent period in days. So that particular set of maps was from beginning of this month, actually, so it was just from 1 week in the beginning of this month. So just the overall findings on the climatic risk and national disease spread. This actually is a cross-reference to Roanne Sutherland's paper yesterday, where she showed pretty much the same data. We found that the maximum weekly infection risk, a long-term average of that, is a pretty good representative for the way that metal rust is spreading down the country over time. And you can see that there's a high risk in the Upper North Island, and surprisingly high risk actually down the west coast of the South Island. And the rust seems to be spreading in that direction, but we don't actually know a lot about the susceptibility of the main Myrtaceae species down there, particularly the southern rata, which so far seems to be relatively resistant. Looking at variation and risk over time, this is the infection risk on this particular graph for two sites in New Zealand, one in the far north at Kerikeri and one in the upper South Island at Motueka. And you can see that most of the time the infection risk is a good deal higher in the Upper North Island, although in the Upper South Island at Motueka, there are some occasions in summer, particularly early summer, when it can be as high actually in that area as in the north. In terms of year-to-year variation, you can see that 2017 and 2018 were very high-risk years. That there's a red vertical bar on the graph towards the left-hand end, which shows when myrtle rust first arrived in New Zealand. And then the risk has been a little bit lower since then, although in the summer and in the winter of 2022, actually, the risk stayed remarkably high through winter, particularly in the northern part of the North Island. And all those things, those kind of unusually high risk events would be driving more myrtle rust development. The latent period curve over time is quite an interesting one because obviously when the latent period gets longer, the risk is lower because it's taking longer to go through its infection cycle. And in the far north, it's there's quite a regular annual pattern of a slightly longer latent period in the winter than the summer. But in the upper South Island at Motueka, we've got these hugely long latent periods, and the reason for that pattern is, of course, that when the mean daily temperatures get down below 10 degrees or around that sort of region, the latent period just becomes really long because of the nature of the response. So if you go further south than that, the latent period actually is much longer again. And that really, the fact that the season, both for infection and for rapid latent development, is way shorter further south than it is further north, really accounts for the distribution of myrtle rust in New Zealand, and also the severity of it as well, largely, I think. So just the significance of the climatic risk modelling. I've got a couple of photos in there just for decoration, really, of Syzygia myri and Lophometus pilatus, two of our most susceptible species. The latent period temperature model explains much of the seasonal activity and spread of myrtle rust in New Zealand. Infection risk peaks in early summer to early autumn, that's December to March. Infection slows in late autumn to early winter, April to June. And the lowest activity is midwinter to early spring, so that there's a bit of a lag really in terms of the meteorological conditions in relation to the time of minimum myrtle rust activity. It's actually getting into the end of winter and the early spring before it hits rock bottom in terms of its activity, which is kind of why a lot of people see myrtle rust at this time of year in the spring and they think, wow, it's going through the winter this time. In actual fact, what's happening in June is that it's infection that had happened in the autumn, which is slowly developing because the temperatures are dropping and the latent period's ending, and you're starting to see it. By the time you get into July, that's all finished and so on. But in the upper North Island on highly susceptible hosts, we're finding 2 epidemic waves per season. The first one is on the spring flush of growth, which is killed off within 2 or 3 months. And myrtle rust in January, for example, in Auckland, you often don't see it. It's just not there until some new flush occurs in the autumn, and then that becomes infected. And that contrasts with the lower risk areas in the lower North Island and South Island, where you tend to get a single wave of infection, which develops a bit more slowly and peaks in January, February. Now, we've also used the myrtle rust process model for modelling fungicide use patterns in nurseries. We took nursery fungicide information from the industry and used the risk model to look at optimum seasonal spraying in different regions, assuming a highly susceptible species. And this piece of work obviously showed much higher requirement for fungicide use in the far north and quite perhaps alarming numbers of fungicides, 35 to 40 in some years up in the far north, whereas down in Canterbury and the South Island, far fewer. Interestingly, that year of 2017-18 would, according to the modelling, would require far more fungicide use to keep myrtle rust in check than most other years. And then so that analysis led on to adapting the myrtle rust model into a decision support tool for some fungicide timing in nurseries. And this is work we've done with the New Zealand Plant Producers Incorporated, that's the nursery industry, and with Hort Plus. And so for this one, we actually use a cumulative form of the risk. It's what thing we call overall risk, which actually combines the latent development rate with the infection risk. And the way the model works is that it's an accumulating risk line that goes through the season, and it goes up more quickly when the conditions are more favourable. As fungicide spray can be applied, and then the dotted part of the line shows a period of fungicide protection. And when that wears off, another one of these yellow horizontal lines appears, which suggests that another fungicide should go on then. And so that way, the nursery managers can pretty much figure out when they should be spraying to optimise their protection. This one is just a cross-reference to James's earlier talk today on the refugia, which used the data from the myrtle rust risk model. And so refugia in this sense, of course, is where the climate is unfavourably cold for myrtle rust in the New Zealand situation, but warm enough for the threatened species to still grow and reproduce. And then we've also done a climate change impact study. This was done with Niwa and Rebecca Campbell in Plant and Food. Looked at a range of climate warming scenarios, and we found that, in quick summary of that work, that there were areas of particular concern for the far north of New Zealand. So that's up in here. This is a T+4, so it's 4-degree increase in average temperature. Eastern Bay of Plenty, another high-risk area, and then down the west coast of the South Island. So that work's actually, well, it's publicly available through a report that's on the MPI website, which has got the URL there. So areas for further development of this modelling approach. We need infection intensity and latent period data for a wider range of host species, because we've got some preliminary data which suggests that some of the more resistant ones, the latent period is substantially longer, which makes a huge difference to the development rate. We're doing some work at the moment with NZPPI. They're quite keen to get into modelling the seasonal leaf flush to define the growth periods when the hosts are vulnerable. And that would be a very nice addition to the model, so that it actually brings the host into the risk calculation as well. And also to incorporate the effects of intense rainfall on spore production and infection, because we're getting some data that we'll be able to model, which shows that with high rainfall intensities, it washes the spores away, basically, probably damages the sporulating structures as well. So yeah, so that's just would like to acknowledge the funding from Ministry for Primary Industries, National Science Challenge, Ngā Taki, and NZPPI, Beyond Myrtle Rust Program, and Auckland Council, and the collaborators of NIWA and Horth Plus, Queensland Government for that latent period work that we did, and Scion and the Department of Conservation. So thank you very much.
So, thank you, Rob. Really good talk. The question is something like, who is the tool for and how do they access it?
Yep, that's a good question. Well, yes, good question, actually. The tool is available on that myrtlerust.com website. What's available there is the weekly risk maps. They're all sitting there. There's also the daily risk that can be in a graphical time series form, which can be pulled up. Cumulative risk as well. It doesn't have all the fungicide application data in there. That's private in the NZPPI website. But yeah, so anybody, it's public, anybody can access that information for New Zealand at least. Yeah.
Angus?
Rob, is the drive for that the fact that nurseries have got to do a lot of spraying to ship their seedlings around?
Yeah, they are. They're doing a lot of spraying. As much as it sort of kind of horrifies it, that's just what they do. And the big nurseries, the big wholesale nurseries, of course, find that it's actually cheaper to spray than to go out monitoring for myrtle rust. So it's something that they do. So the aim is really to get them to do it as efficiently as possible.
Any more questions? I guess this model could be applied to Australia or kind of anywhere.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty keen to actually do some modelling for Australia as well. I've actually got a Korean professor doing a sabbatical with me in the coming year, and he's a modelling whiz. So we're hoping to do some modelling for Australia as well, with this sort of finer time and spatial scale resolution. Yeah.
The other thing that I was thinking about is Europe. So recently, there's one myrtle in Europe, common myrtle, and that's been found to be highly susceptible.
Yes.
So it'd be quite interesting to look.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, they've actually published a paper on that, and it references our latent period work that was done in Brisbane. Yeah. So their comment in the paper was about the latent overwintering, where when you've got these very long latent periods through the winter period, if it's over sort of 1 to 2 months, you can effectively say that the fungus is inside the plant overwinters. So it's latent overwintering. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob.